First, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 contains a provision that prohibits a telecommunications carrier from disclosing customer proprietary network information, including information that relates to the location of a customer of a telecommunications carrier that's made available to the carrier by the customer solely by virtue of the carrier-customer relationship. Although the FCC has undertaken significant enforcement of this provision, the provision has its limitations. In particular, it does not apply to methodologies that generate location information independent of a telecommunications carrier. Second, the Stored Communications Act, adopted in 1986 as part of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, is a federal statute that protects the contents of certain wire and electronic communications, as well as certain customer records. More specifically, the statute prohibits service providers from sharing the content of customer communications without the customer's consent. It also prohibits service providers from disclosing customer records to a governmental entity, subject to certain exceptions. But this statute, too, has its ambiguities and limitations. First, the statute does not state a clear standard for protection of location information. Second, the Stored Communications Act only covers the actions of certain kinds of providers, those that offer electronic communication services and those that offer remote computing services. It is thus unlikely to cover some of the app developers or other third parties whose products generate or receive location information. A third statute is the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits certain unfair and deceptive trade practices. The statute has sometimes been used to pursue privacy claims, but traditionally the Federal Trade Commission has limited its enforcement of the statute to circumstances in which a company makes an affirmative misstatement in a privacy policy or similar document. In short, statutory law at the federal level does not provide robust protection for the privacy of location information. So what are some of the possible regulatory alternatives? Well, some argue that no significant government intervention is needed. If consumers want additional protection of location information, the argument goes, the market will produce it. Earlier, we talked about retailers' use of mobile location analytics. Some of the underlying privacy concerns were addressed not by government regulation, but by changes in the industry, the adoption of operating systems that randomly generate a MAC address. Relatedly, some argue that industry self-regulation is sufficient and that the shadow of government regulation will push companies in the right direction. For example, the Federal Trade Commission has long advocated that industries follow Fair Information Practices, or FIPS. Under those practices, those who collect information should provide notice about their information collection practices. They should provide choice about whether and how personal information should be used for purposes beyond that for which the information was provided. They should provide access to data so that users can assess its accuracy and completeness. And they should ensure the security of data from unauthorized disclosure. Finally, there should be a mechanism for enforcement to detect and impose sanctions for noncompliance. But many privacy advocates argue that FIPS are inadequate. For example, even when a company seeks to mirror FIPS for its own activities, what is its obligation to ensure that third parties, for example, application developers, adhere to FIPS? So another approach is to rely on a third-party trust authority to certify that privacy practices meet particular substantive standards. Although the third-party trust model is widespread for online privacy, some skeptics question its effectiveness. For example, do the certifying authorities impose high enough substantive standards for a certification? When will a trust authority decertify a company based on its activities? And does the trust authority's underlying revenue model undermine its ability to serve as a neutral arbiter of companies' privacy practices? Finally, another approach to location privacy would be to adopt mandatory standards. For example, the Federal Trade Commission could go beyond enforcement of privacy policies and move toward common law-like development of fair information privacy standards. The Federal Trade Commission has made this move in some areas. Or Congress could adopt a sector-specific approach to location privacy and impose mandatory standards, or could adopt a broader data privacy approach along the lines that Europe has pursued.